Lecture. As many of you will be aware, the Rosen Lecture was endowed by the late Irving and Jeannie Rosen, and the memories be a blessing, 30 years ago. And each year we've been grateful to be able to use the endowment to have yearly lectures devoted to subjects of importance to Jewish studies and to this university. In fact, while you were waiting for this lecture to begin, we had a retrospective of 30 years of Rosen Lectures that was prepared by Professor Dorit Naaman, and with one addition. As you may have noticed, we also included a slide with Jeannie. For the first time since these lectures began 30 years ago, Jeannie is no longer able to attend. And as we think of her contribution to Jewish studies here at Queen's, I'm reminded of a saying by Hillel from the 2nd chapter of Pirkei Avot, in which he says, "Do not keep aloof from the community." I can't imagine anyone for whom that saying was more woven into her life than Jeannie Rosen. She certainly did not keep aloof from the community. She was always in attendance, eager to learn. Here at these lectures, a gracious host, and we are very grateful to her commitment to the Queen's community. And we'll look forward to years of lectures to come in her and Irving's name as we continue to support Jewish studies here at Queen's. The Rosen Lecture Committee reports to the Provost Advisory Committee for the Promotion of the Arts. And if there are anybody here from the university community that's interested in sitting on the Rosen Committee, there are positions open each year. We also will be circulating the community here at Queen's for nominations for possible speakers. You can find all that information on the Rosen Lecture webpage in the Provost's office. Members of the Rosen family, of course, do not sit on this committee. It's a university committee. If you have any concerns or suggestions about our direction as we go forward, please direct them to me, the chair of the committee, or better yet, stand for the committee and make your voice heard at its deliberations. Queen's has a Jewish Studies Facebook page, and I urge you to check or friend it so you can keep abreast of what's been happening with Jewish Studies here at Queen's. I would like to thank the Provost Office for their support, members of our committee, and especially tonight Cindy Fair, who is the administrative assistant, who's done so much through the Department of History to arrange for tonight's lecture. We'll be having 1 or 2 lectures in 2019, and it looks like our next lecture will probably be in March the 6th, 2019. But without further ado, we're here tonight to listen to the 2018 Rosen Lecturer, and I would like to ask Professor Dorit Naaman to come forward and introduce her to you. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for being here. It is indeed sad to not have Jeannie with us, and different, but I think that her legacy of caring so much for the intellectual vibrancy in Kingston and for life much beyond the academia and beyond the Jewish community, I think will stay with us for a long time, especially through the vibrancy of this lecture series. It is a great honor to introduce Professor Ruth Behar tonight. Professor Behar is an anthropologist, a poet, a fiction writer, and a documentary filmmaker. She was born in Cuba to a Jewish family, was raised in Queens, New York, and teaches at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She has worked in Spain, Mexico, and Cuba, and whether academically or artistically, her work tackles questions of immigration, home, and identity in a global era. Dr. Behar academic books, and I'm only going to list the monographs, include The Presence of the Past in a Spanish Village, Translated Woman, Crossing the Border with Esperanza's Story, The Vulnerable Observer, Anthropology That Breaks Your Heart. Isn't that a great title? Really? And An Island Called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba. Behar directed the documentary Adieu Vida. You'll have to excuse me with all my Spanish pronunciation because I'm not a Spanish speaker. Goodbye, Dear Love, A Cuban Sephardic Journey. Has published Traveling Heavy, a memoir in between journeys, and poetry in numerous anthologies. Her teen novel, Lucky Broken Girl, won the 2018 Cora Belpre Author Award. Dr. Behar has won the Guggenheim, MacArthur, and Fulbright Fellowships, among many others. Perhaps with the exception of being a brain surgeon, it is pretty easy to say that Dr. Behar's career fulfills the dreams of any Jewish mother worldwide. I hope your mother feels. To me, her book, The Vulnerable Observer, is a testament of deep intellectual integrity and courage. At a time when anthropology was perhaps no longer produced only by white men, but where models to do anthropology responsibly, with respect, reflexivity, and reciprocity were just emerging, Ruth Behar offered a model for ethnography that inspired 2 decades of ethnographic work. To write in the first person as a woman, both Jewish and Cuban, at a time where the third person objectivity, quote-unquote, was expected, was groundbreaking. It is particularly wonderful to have the Rosen Lecture this week. We are in the midst of dealing with a wave of white supremacy in North America, and with its anti-Semitic version last week in the attack in Pittsburgh. And to be able to celebrate Jewish life and thought, to be reminded of diverse experiences of world communities, is an affirming act. Let me close by reading the last 2 verses from a poem by Ruth Behar, from 2 Women, One Island. There's always the last day in La Habana. On Cat 15, where I once lived, the men are finishing their domino game. Around the corner, at the Patronado Synagogue, our sacred Torah is safe. We Jews have nothing to fear in Cuba. Esteves has called from Matanzas to wish me a good trip and make me laugh. Christy, who's never flown anywhere, has promised to recite a rosary, yet again, so my plane won't crash, and says, don't worry, Ruti, you'll get there just fine. There's always the last day in La Habana, when I want to still be there, but I know I'm already far away. Tomorrow, I will be struggling to find the words to explain how I feel. This is my last day in La Habana, and I have left, even before saying goodbye. Well, thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. That was so beautiful. I'm so honored by everything you said and reading that poem. Thank you so much, Dorit. And so I want to thank everybody who's involved with my visit, Professor Morrow and Professor Adelman, Rebecca Manley, Professor Manley, Cindy Farrow, Cindy? Yeah. Thank you for everything, for taking care of all the logistics so gracefully. Also want to thank everybody who came to the workshop this morning, the Cultural Studies workshop, all the faculty and students that were there. That was really amazing. I don't know if Jeff Brisson is here, but did a great job of organizing that. And thanks Scott Morganson, a fellow anthropologist who I met today, and another amazing thing, I don't know if she's here, but a friend from Cuba, turns out that she is a graduate student now here, and got to see her at dinner, Senya, so another amazing surprise. So thanks so much for everything. I'm really glad to be at Queen's University. It really is a pleasure. And I want to add to what was just said that As I was preparing my lecture for today, I was thinking about the Shivas, the morning rituals that are taking place for the 11 Jews killed while praying at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh on Saturday. This anti-Semitic slaughter has affected me as the Jew that I am, but the weight of fear and worry and uncertainty I feel now as a Jew in the United States is inseparable from the fear, worry, and uncertainty that I feel now as I observe the cruel and dehumanizing treatment directed at immigrants from Mexico and Central America who are risking their lives for the chance to seek asylum in the United States. And as we speak now, there are over 5,000 active duty troops headed to the border to push them back. So I arrived in the US as a child immigrant from Cuba, and my awareness of being a Jew and a Latina is always with me in my life and work. But never before has the confluences of these two identities, Jewish and Latina, felt as intense as it does at this moment in history. It's as if the two sides of my persona are being awakened, asked to arise at the same time. So today I'll speak in the different voices I have woven together throughout my life. In this voice of a Jewish Latina, Jewish Cubana, in the voice of a cultural anthropologist, in the voice of a poet, filmmaker, fiction writer, perhaps most crucially, in the voice of a woman who feels deep gratitude for the choice my ancestors made to go in search of their America in Cuba. As the title of my lecture suggests, there is a quandary for me in telling the story of the Jews of Cuba. How do I tell this story? Is it one story or several stories? As the title suggests, there are different dimensions to this story: memories, stories, dilemmas. All three come to mind when I think about how to tell the story of the Jews of Cuba. And so as I move between memories, stories, dilemmas, my aim will be not just to share information about a Jewish people whose cultural ties are to Cuba, but to think about how I'm telling what I know about them. And I'm going to tell these stories, so I ended up writing a whole lecture and then just ditching it because I don't want to read a lecture. So I'm going to tell the story via photographs, different sorts of photographs, old, new, personal photographs, ethnographic photographs, family pictures. And it's really the photographs that are going to make possible the storytelling. And so this will be a photo essay, a talk assisted by images, a talk that really I can only give with images. So let's get started. Let's see. Here. Perfect. All right. First slide. So to begin to tell the story of the Jews of Cuba, where do I begin? And I thought this might be a good starting point. The US-Cuba relation, the quote-unquote good friends that happens after the Spanish-American War, and as you probably know, Cuba was fighting for its independence throughout the 19th century. They had 3 independence wars, and the last one, the United States intervened, supposedly to help Cuba win its independence, but it ended up being a way of colonizing Cuba, and this was very much felt by many Cubans later on, and especially Fidel Castro, who felt that there was this revolution that needed to be finished, and it was this revolution of the 19th century in which the United States intervened. And so that's the moment at which the United States becomes heavily involved in Cuba after the Spanish-American War in 1898. And it's after that, after the end of the Spanish colony, and as you know, the Spanish colony only allowed one religion to exist, which was Catholicism, and of course there was a whole Inquisition in Spain for those that converted to Catholicism and to check to see if they had converted sincerely and fully. And so it's after the end of the Spanish colony and after this American intervention that religious freedom becomes possible in Cuba, and with the entrance of Americans, that's when Protestantism enters Cuba, and it's also when Judaism enters Cuba, so at the beginning of the 20th century. And so I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about my family, and through my family tell you the story of the Jewish settlement of Cuba. So Jews began to move to Cuba in the early 20th century. The first Jews to live in Cuba openly, publicly as Jews were American Jews, some of whom had actually fought in the Spanish-American War. And after that, it was Sephardic Jews who began to settle in Cuba. Sephardic Jews, and the word Sepharad is Spain in Hebrew. And so the word Sepharad evokes those Jews that were from Spain. And most of them left in the 15th century and found their way to various countries of the former Ottoman Empire. And this was the case with my father's family. My father's family is Sephardic from Turkey. And here in this picture you see my paternal grandparents, my grandfather and grandmother, who arrived in Cuba in the 1920s. And they went for many reasons. This was at the end after the Ottoman Empire dissolved, and they went for economic reasons, for cultural reasons, political reasons. The men were very afraid to serve in the Turkish army, and so they were trying to get out of Turkey, and that was the case with my grandfather, who you see here. And the women were leaving for various reasons. They often left with their families, not alone, but my grandmother, Rebecca, left on her own. Very curiously, she was the oldest of 5 sisters, and she was sent to Cuba on an arranged marriage. And when she got to Cuba, the man she was supposed to marry had married someone else. So she was in a difficult situation. But she played the oud, and you know what the oud is, beautiful Middle Eastern instrument. She played the oud, and she sang these Sephardic songs in Ladino, in Judeo-Espanol. And at some point she was singing, and my grandfather to be, happened to pass by, heard the singing, fell in love with her, and that was how they got to know each other. And they were from the same town, Silivri, which is very close to Istanbul, and is almost together with Istanbul at this point in time. And they were part of this Sephardic community, a few thousand people that arrived in the 1910s and 1920s, and they founded the first synagogue in Cuba, the Shevet Achim synagogue. And just curiously, where do you think this synagogue ended up being located, of all the possible streets in Old Havana where it might have found its place? Anybody have any idea? It's kind of interesting. Well, it was on the Calle Inquisidor, on the street of the Inquisitor. This is where the Shevet Achim synagogue ended up. It has since closed because unfortunately the roof was caving in and they had to close it. But I was able to film in the Shevet Achim synagogue when I made Dio Querido. But so this is the very oldest synagogue of Cuba, founded in 1913. But the majority of the Jews who settled in Cuba came in the 1920s after the passage of the Immigration Act, the American Immigration Act of 1924, which essentially established a quota system on the immigration of Jews and others as well, Eastern and Southern European people. And so it was very, very hard to come into the United States, and many Jews in this period between World War I and World War II were seeking to escape. They could already see the situation, and they were trying to get out. But they couldn't get to the United States, but they could get to Cuba, because Cuba at this point in time had an open door to immigrants. It was very easy to arrive in Cuba with a minimal amount of money. You could establish yourself and then you were allowed in. Why was Cuba doing this at this time? Because they were very concerned about the growth of the black population in Cuba, and they wanted to whiten the population. So they really encouraged European immigration, and at that time, Jewish immigrants were just viewed as European immigrants. So many entered at this time, including many of these Polish Jews in particular. Many of them, like my grandmother, who you see here, who was my maternal grandmother, who was from Poland. And in fact, so many Jews came from Poland to Cuba that the term for a Jew in Cuba is Polaco. To this day, they say Los Polacos, and they're referring to Jews, whether you're Sephardic or Turkish or whatever, it doesn't matter. That became the term for a Jew in Cuba because there was such a large migration of Jews from Poland. And so my maternal grandmother was among them, and she also has an interesting story, as my other grandmother does. Her story is that my great-grandfather was the first to go to Cuba in the 1920s, and after a few years, he made enough money to bring one of his 7 children to Cuba. So he wrote a letter back to Poland and he said, I can only bring one of my children, and I think it should be my son Moshe, who was the 2nd oldest of the children. But my grandmother was the oldest. My grandmother Esther was the oldest. And so she wrote a letter to him saying, no, I should be the one to go first to Cuba because I'm the eldest, and even if I'm a girl, I'm going to work really hard to help you bring the rest of the family to Cuba. And that's what happened. So she was the first to go to Cuba of the 7 children. She was from Wawrowo in Poland, not too far from Warsaw. And there were others who came from this town and many from this region of Poland. And she ends up meeting my grandfather, a Russian Jew. He had a store in a town called Artemisa, not too far from Havana. He had a little fabric store, and it just so happened that she ended up working there. She got a job in his store as an employee. And the way he courted her was that he would get copies of Yiddish newspapers from New York. And this was a big deal in Cuba, and she was a recent immigrant, a Yiddish speaker as he was as well. And he would give her these newspapers, and this is kind of how the courtship began, these Yiddish newspapers, and then eventually asked to marry her, and they married, and I find this so fascinating, this 1929 invitation that's in Yiddish and Spanish, suggesting that by 1929 there was enough of a community that they had a printing press and so on that could produce this invitation. And so one of the jokes that my grandfather liked to tell that my grandmother didn't like to hear is he would say, well, I had to marry her because it was really expensive to have her as an employee. It was going to be a lot cheaper to have her as a wife. And the reason he would say that is that he was overpaying her so that she would keep working for him because he loved her so much. So it was one of the stories I grew up hearing, and I've inherited a lot of these documents that I would see that they would show to me as I was growing up, and this invitation was something that my grandparents often shared with me. So this was my grandfather's railway ID card, and this was something he was very proud of. When he got to Cuba, he was Moishe Gliniensky, and he became Maximo Glinsky, kind of like Ellis Island, where people had their names changed when they arrived. And he arrived and he worked on the railroad in Cuba. And he was extremely proud of this. He was very poor, as all of these immigrants were, penniless. And he worked on the railroad in Camagüey. And it was just something always so fascinating to me to think that my Russian Jewish grandfather had helped to build a railroad in Cuba. So I inherited this. But most of the men, when they arrived from Europe, worked as peddlers in Cuba. This is a photograph of my grandfather's younger brother, Simon. And so most of the men fanned out all over Cuba as peddlers. They were very well-known figures in the Cuban landscape, and they would sell fabric and clothes and all kinds of things, watches. They'd go to the countryside with things just like hanging from their shoulders, as you see here, and peddle. And one of the things they introduced to Cuba that they're remembered for this is they introduced the installment plan, payment by the installment plan, so that you could get something and then pay for it in 2 or 3 installments, and you could get that thing you wanted and then pay for it gradually. And so these Jewish immigrants introduced that to Cuba, particularly in the countryside in Cuba. And so I love this picture. So here, as I said, my grandmother, her mission was to help bring the rest of the family from Poland, just as immigrants today work so hard to get others here from various parts of the world and from Latin America in particular. And so here, over here to the left, in the white dress is my grandmother with my grandfather, and at the very end is my great-grandfather. And so the 3 of them were working together to get everybody else out. In that back row, those are my grandmother's younger siblings, and the young man here in the white outfit was her youngest brother, and behind my grandfather is his younger brother. And so the family was reunited, and it took several years. It took till 1934 to reunite the family. And they all went to live in this country town in Matanzas. And they were the only Jewish family there. They had a general store, and they all worked together. And one of the things I love about this picture, so at the end there, that's my great-grandfather with that Panama hat. And what I find so curious is that he doesn't look like a Polish Jew, he looks like a Cuban. He looks like Jose Marti. And look just how quickly that transformation happened. This very Orthodox Jewish elder from this era became very, very, it looks like to me like a Yosemite. So anyway, so the family was reunited, and just here, just showing you some of those roots on the map. But I don't want to paint just a happy picture of this Jewish migration to Cuba, because there was also a very, very tragic moment in this history that you've probably all heard of in one way or another, because whenever people talk about the Jews of Cuba, they always ask about or mention the St. Louis. And so this was a very tragic moment. In 1939, this luxury liner arrived from Germany. These were German Jews, over 900 people that were escaping the Nazis. They had paid a fortune to be able to get on the ship, and it also paid for visas, for landing permits, and so on. And thought they were arriving legally to Cuba. They arrived in Havana at the end of May 1939. But it turned out that at the time, the President Federico Bru was in an argument with the Minister of Immigration at the time, and when he decided to invalidate all of these landing permits, even before these people got on the ship. But they didn't know that, and they went to Cuba, the St. Louis, and they were forced to hang out there at the Havana harbor. They weren't even allowed to get to the pier, and trying valiantly, they and many Jewish organizations in Cuba and in the United States and elsewhere, trying to grant permission for them to disembark. But in the end, they were forced to go back to Europe, and there were some that survived. There were 200 that were taken in by the United Kingdom and other countries, so there were some that survived, but about 250 of these people ended up perishing in the Holocaust. And so it was a very, very sad moment in Cuban history. It's been written about in scholarship and in novels and films. You may have heard of Voyage of the Damned, the famous film with Faye Dunaway. And so it was a very, very sad moment. These people who were just there and unable to enter Cuba, these Jews, and it was all also part of a Nazi plot. The Nazis had sent a lot of people to Cuba to also spread Nazi propaganda, and the Jewish the press at the time also spread a lot of Nazi propaganda as well. So it was a moment, a terrible moment. For Cuba, and Cuba's often blamed for this, but the United States and Canada also didn't accept these refugees. So sort of everybody in the end was to blame, but it's very much viewed as a Cuban issue, and Cubans think about this very often. But I think of it as kind of an unfortunate moment in Jewish Cuban history, because overall Jews in Cuba are very, very well accepted and really came to find a sense of home on the island. But I always think about those that didn't get to Cuba because they were kind of a presence in my life. And there were these two pictures that always hung in my grandparents' various apartments, and it took a while before I finally asked who they were. And I found out that there were people in our family that chose not to immigrate to Cuba, and they ended up dying in the Holocaust. So this was my grandmother's grandmother, who chose not to go to Cuba. She was very religious, and she was afraid she wouldn't be able to keep up her religious traditions in Cuba. All she knew of Cuba was that it was like this jungle, and she didn't want to go. And she stayed behind, and she died, and so did my grandfather's mother, who you see here. So the stories of those who came and couldn't get in, and also those who stayed and perished, all became very much sort of a part of my consciousness in thinking about this history. So my maternal grandparents, who you see here, ended up staying in that rural town where the family reunited. The rest of the family ended up moving to the city of Matanzas and to Havana, but they stayed in this rural town in Matanzas, which had many sugar mills, and was also a center of slavery and a center of Afro-Cuban religion. People call it Little Africa, Pequeña Africa, because there's such a strong tradition there of African religious customs. And so that's where they were. That's where my grandparents were, with my aunt, the older girl, and my mother there. So they started out in this little rural town. They were the only Jewish kids. They went to a regular school in Agramonte. And my grandparents were worried, because what's going to happen to these girls? They're not getting a Jewish education. We have to try to get to Havana. By that point, by the 1930s, 1940s, There were Jewish schools in Havana, there was Jewish publications, Jewish theater. There was a very strong Jewish community that formed very, very quickly and was very, very solid and strong. The community came to be between 15,000 and 20,000 people, but they couldn't get to Havana because they didn't have the means. They just had this very basic store in Agramonte in this town. But what happened? My grandfather played the lottery in Cuba, and he won. He won 5,000 Cuban pesos, which was real money in those days, and they moved to Havana. So that was how they moved from the countryside to Havana in the 1940s, and they opened up a lace store on Calle Aguacate, on Avocado Street. That's where their lace store was, and like many businesses of that time, they lived right above the store. It was a tiny little store, and they had this one employee who worked with them. And my mother, who's the girl in the middle with the braid, was finally able to go to a Jewish school in Havana. And schools at that time, the Ashkenazi schools, classes were taught in Yiddish and Spanish. Right? So, and that's exactly the school that I was enrolled in right before we left Cuba. I was briefly in a school where I would have been taught Yiddish and Spanish. And by the 1950s, as you can see from this picture, there's a sense that the family has prospered, right? You have this sense of this polished kind of prosperity. And I use it to evoke the prosperity of the Jewish community by this point. By the 1950s, the community was a prosperous community. Most had begun as peddlers, penniless, struggling to make a living. And by the 50s, the majority of the community was doing well. There were certainly people struggling as well, but many were doing well, and most of the Jews had small shops or factories, were working in business in one way or another. But the community was also very divided and separated in many ways. The small Jewish community also had all of these divisions. Adela Doran, who is the president of the Jewish community in Cuba, likes to make this joke. I don't know if I'm going to tell it properly, that if there's 2 Jews, there's 3 synagogues. Is that the joke? So it's sort of like that, where there were there's small community, but there were lots of different enclaves and splits within the community, splits between the Zionists and the communists and those that were religious and those that weren't. And so there were many divisions within the community. And there were also different ethnic groups within the community and different enclaves. And so what I learned about, of course, growing up with this, was that there was a huge division between the Ashkenazi community, in other words, those of Eastern European background, Polish, Russian background in this case, and those who were Sephardic of Turkish background. And so when my parents met, and my mother being of Yiddish background and my father of Sephardic background, this was a huge thing. It was like, oh my God, especially in my mother's family. It was very, very just confusing. My maternal grandmother told the story many times, like, how was it possible that Albertico, being Jewish, didn't speak Yiddish? How could you be Jewish and not speak Yiddish? Yiddishness was really a marker of Jewishness for Eastern European Jews, but Sephardic Jews don't speak Yiddish because their background is Spanish, and so they speak an old Spanish called Judeo-Espanol, or Ladino, this 15th century Spanish, with many other languages woven in, Turkish and French and Italian, and many other languages woven in. And so that's what my father's family spoke. And so this union of my parents was a struggle for them to find their way to their marriage, but they finally did marry. And it was very interesting kind of growing up, like hearing the stereotypes about Sephardic Jews from my Ashkenazi family. It was always like, well, those Sephardic Jews, they really have a temper. They really have, a lot of very fierce. So then my grandmother liked to say that I took after that sort of so anyway, so they did finally converge through marriage and came together. And so my parents marrying in 1956 were looking to a future in Cuba, as were the Jews in this period. These were the Jews that had decided to stay in Cuba, because many did use Cuba as a kind of trampoline to then migrate to the United States, because a Jewish person who got to Cuba and acquired Cuban residency or Cuban passport could then pretty easily migrate to the United States. But those that I'm talking about here were the ones that decided to really make Cuba their America. They liked Cuba, they decided to stay there. My parents were part of that community, and they were just looking to this future in Cuba. And so Cuba in the 50s, you probably know this, and some of these images may be familiar, was a site of tourism. And here you see some of the symbols, right, the casinos and the Tropicana and dancing girls and so on. All of those were some of the images that people had, the fantasy or the idea of Cuba. And Cuba is so close to the United States, the tip of Florida, and there were these ferries that you could take where you could literally take your car. Those of you that know, like the Staten Island ferry in New York, you could put your car on the ferry and you've got your car when you get there. It was the same in Cuba. You could take a ferry over to Cuba and drive around with your own car. And on these flights from Miami to Cuba, they even had Tropicana performers would perform on the flight to get people ready for a weekend in Cuba, a weekend seeing the Tropicana. So these kind of fantasies that people had of Cuba were also very much produced by Cuban tourism as well. So this is the era in which my parents married and really acquired their Cuban identities. And the Jews were part of this as well. They also advertised, as you see here, they advertised for the Tropicana in Yiddish and Spanish. And so they were part of this Cuban culture at that time in the 50s. There was an American Jewish restaurant. As I said, there were a couple of American Jews. There was even a Reformed temple in Havana that later closed down, but there was a Reformed temple in Havana that American Jews attended, and services were in English. So there was this presence as well, but those Jews in Cuba that settled in Cuba, that really became Cuban Jews, they were trying to find a way to connect with Cuban history and Cuban culture, and they had this event where they honored Jose Marti, the great independence leader of Cuba that I spoke about before. And don't you think my great-grandfather really resembles that picture? So the 50s is this moment of consolidation of the Jewish community, and this is when they build major synagogues in Havana. And this one, for those of you that have been to Cuba, you probably are familiar with this one. You've seen this one. We called it El Patronato, also called Beth Shalom. And this is a major synagogue, major Jewish community center in Havana, in the newer part of Havana, the area known as Vedado. And the architect was Capablanca, a very famous Cuban architect at the time. So this was the big Jewish community center. They started to build it in the mid-50s and ended it towards the late 50s. And it was and is a massive synagogue that took up a whole block in Havana. And it has a library, it had a banquet hall, and it had all kinds of spaces. It's really an enormous space, and really showed that the Jews were planning to stay in Cuba. This was already the late 50s. The Sephardic Jews also created their large temple, and here you can't really appreciate it in this picture, but it also has a very large sanctuary. It takes up a large space on 17th and E, also in the Vedado neighborhood. And this synagogue, the Sephardic synagogue, was literally being built just as the Jews were leaving after Fidel Castro came to power. So these two major institutions were built in the 50s, and this Jewish community expected, obviously, to stay in Cuba. They were building these institutions. Fidel Castro comes into power in 1959, early January of 1959, and the Jewish community supported the revolution. Like everybody else, or like 95% of the Cuban people, they were against the corruption of the government and all the things that were terrible about Cuba in the 1950s. And so in the first couple of years of the revolution, many of the Jews stayed put and thought they were going to be part of this process. So here's my mother in the apartment where we lived in Havana, and they were very happy with the revolution. They were a young couple, just married, 2 young children, me and my brother. And one of the first reforms that Fidel Castro enacted was to reduce rents by half. It was like, great, they were renters. We only have to pay half the amount of rent. So they were very happy at first with this revolution. And my mother went out and bought that lamp with some of the savings from the rent. It's quite a nice lamp. I wish I could have brought it. And so I was a child in this time, and on the famous Malecon with my mother, and then standing here in front of this Patronato synagogue that I just told you about. We lived half a block away from the synagogue, And this park also in Vedado that I go to often when I go back to Cuba. And so I was in Cuba, I was a child then, but remember so little because I was so small. And it's almost as if these pictures are evidence to me that I was really there, that I was really born in this place. And so what happened? So initially, as I said, the Jewish community thought it was going to stay put. Then things started to emerge in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs invasion that you all know about in April of '61. That was the moment in which Fidel Castro declared that the revolution was going to be communist, and turned to the Russians for support. The United States broke with Cuba. And that was when many in the Jewish community, 90% of this community, decided to leave Cuba. Properties were nationalized as they turned to a communist system, and most of the Jews had been owners of small properties of various kinds or small businesses of various kinds. My paternal grandfather, the Turkish grandfather, was still working as a peddler at this time, but it wasn't going to be possible even to work as a peddler under the new system. So this community dissolves in the early 60s. Most of them leave for Miami and New York, and this is actually my grandmother leaving Cuba there, carrying that box. And this very moving picture taken by Jose Figueroa, a contemporary photographer who lives on the island. And in this picture, he's waving goodbye to his own mother, who is leaving Cuba. So this was a moment where the Cuban nation was just torn apart by immigration. Those who left were viewed as anti-revolutionaries. They were called the worms of the revolution. And it was a time in which those who left were quite scared to leave. They had to leave behind all of their possessions and find their way to an uncertain and new beginning. This was my grandfather's passport when he entered the U.S. I love it for unsettled nationality. And what was so interesting is that because people couldn't take much with them, they had to leave everything behind. The one thing they took, and it was something that the women were really worried about, is they took the photographs, right? And so thanks to my mother and my grandmother taking all these photographs, I've been able to reconstruct this past of my family in Cuba. So the photographs became very, very important things for us. And so then this second migration, so the first was from Europe to Cuba, and then this second diaspora now from Cuba to the US, and we went on to Queens, New York. Here I am with my parents and my little brother. And we went to live in this working class neighborhood in Queens. It's curiously enough called Queens, Queens, New York. And that was very immigrant and very, very diverse neighborhood. And so growing up with this Jewish Cuban culture was very interesting, growing up with that in New York and kind of getting it from like every side of my family, and particularly from the food, which was something I always thought about. My mother has always loved to cook, and so she would make the Cuban dishes, and my grandmothers would make the Jewish dishes. And so these recipes, I don't know if you can figure out what that's a recipe for. It's in Spanish, but anybody want to guess what that is? Very good. That's gefilte fish. So you see the fish are at the right-hand corner: white fish and yellow fish and carp. But then she has here on the left, 5 libras pescado. So pescado is fish, but then they're in English because she's going to have to go to the fish shop and ask for them in English. So she's got them there. So this is my maternal grandmother's recipe for gefilte fish in Spanish. And then my mother's recipe for black beans, or frijoles negros. So this is kind of how I grew up, with this kind of mix of these different cuisines and cultures. And I would have to tell a much longer story, but anyway, all of this eventually leads me to anthropology and to want to study Cuba. And so literally researching home. And my initial trips, I first went in 1979 as a student. But then in the early 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when it became much easier to travel to Cuba, I began to travel on a regular basis. I had lived in Spain and Mexico, and then found my way to Cuba again in the early 90s. And in those first trips, I was just trying to literally stand in the same places where I had stood as a child. So as you can see there. So just literally trying to reoccupy those spaces in some way, reclaim them, see if some memories would come back if I stood in the actual places of my childhood. And so those first few trips were, were very interesting. I wasn't sure what I was actually looking for, but I would go back to all the places where my family had lived. I kept returning to the same places over and over until I no longer knew what I was returning for. And at this time, I reconnected with this woman, Caridad, or Caro, who was my nanny in Cuba. She took care of me and my brother when we were small. And her older sister had taken care of my second cousins, Alma and Henry. And so when I got to Cuba, and my mother had said, well, maybe you'll find Caro. I have this address, this old address for her from when we used to write letters to each other, because they had stayed in touch. She and my mother had gotten along, and so I had this address, and I found her. And one of the shocking things to me, because I had been expecting that Cubans would not want to meet me or talk to me. I had thought they would just see me as a worm of the revolution, right? I just assumed like they would hate me. And Caro was, not at all like that at all. She was very, very loving, was very glad to see me, and she shocked me because she had all of these pictures of my Jewish family. She had held on to them. So here she has a picture of my cousin Alma. Here she has pictures of my great-grandparents, right? She had held on to these pictures during all these years. We left in the early 60s, this is the early 90s, and she had these pictures. They were in the same box as the pictures of her own children, of her twin sons and daughter. And so it was amazing to me that she had this, that she remembered us. She was kind of literally holding on to Jewish memory, right? An Afro-Cuban woman who's not Jewish. And so it was kind of a shock to me. And I had gone to Cuba on one of these early trips in the 90s. And my great-aunt and great-uncle, who you see here, they asked me if I would find the tomb of their son, Henry. So this little boy you see here, Henry, died of leukemia in Cuba. And it was a huge tragedy for the family because Cuba had saved them from the Holocaust. And then this boy became ill with leukemia, and there was nothing they could do. He was dying. They even brought him to the United States to see what could be done, and they couldn't save this boy. So it was a terrible tragedy in the family, and though I didn't know him, I grew up hearing about Henry all the time when I was young. And so they asked me, nobody in the family had been back to Cuba. Nobody in the family really thought you should go back to Cuba, but I was the first to go. And they said to me, could you go to the cemetery and see if you can find Henry's tomb? We don't think you're going to find it because with communism and the revolution, probably that cemetery is no longer there. And so there's two Jewish cemeteries outside of Havana in a town called Guanabacoa. And I went and found the tomb. The tomb was there, the cemetery was still there, is still there, and I found Henry's tomb there. And so that was a discovery. But I also discovered that Caro and her older sister Tere, who had taken care of Henry when he was dying, that they had continued periodically to go to the Jewish cemetery and would visit this grave because they knew this boy, and they knew that all of our family had left Cuba, so none of us were going to visit the grave, and so they would go and visit. That led me to write a poem that my family didn't like very much. Outside of Havana are the Jews who won't leave Cuba until the coming of the Messiah. I go searching for the grave of my cousin. Poor boy, he got left behind with the few living Jews and all the dead ones for whom the doves pray. My aunt and uncle were wrong. Henry Levin is not abandoned. Your criada, the black woman who didn't marry to care for him, tends his grave. Tere tells me she can't forget Henry. He died in her arms. Your family left you, cousin, so thank God for a black woman who still visits your little bones. So you can understand why they were not very happy with this poem, but it was what I felt I had to write at the time. And Caro, who's still alive, but now much older in her 90s, was very energetic still at that time, and she would always go with me to the airport every time I left Cuba again, literally repeating the experience because she had been there when I was a child leaving Cuba. So we would reenact this departure scene on all of my early visits to Cuba. So I moved on from there, from this very emotional time of reconnecting with Cuba, to trying to figure out if I could do, or what I could do as an anthropologist to study Cuba. And I started with trying to tell some of the Sephardic stories. And so this was in the 90s, and this is a period of great crisis in Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union and the decline of Russian help in Cuba. And Cuba went into a kind of economic free fall. There was just tremendous hunger, scarcity, and so on. And many people left Cuba in this period. There was the rafter crisis, the Balsero crisis in 1994, and many people left on rafts. There was a riot at this time. Fidel Castro opened the ports, and many, many people left. And this wonderful artwork by Sandra Ramos shows how the whole island of Cuba felt like a raft at this time as people were leaving. And so people were leaving in all kinds of ways. And these men tried to create this truck boat, which I think was pure genius. And they wanted to see if they could get across the ocean to Florida, and then once they got to Florida, they would just drive. That was the plan. It would be this. But they were caught and sent back. And I've always said that they should have been allowed to stay in the U.S. because these guys are brilliant. This is a brilliant act of engineering. They should have been allowed to stay, sent back to Cuba. Anyway, so I made this movie, Adieu Querida, Goodbye Dear Love, and Adieu Querida is a very famous Sephardic song. And I decided to go in search of Sephardic memories because my father is Sephardic, and my father's totally against my trips to Cuba and totally against my reconnection with Cuba. And I thought, I'm going to go for him. I'm going to create a movie for him about the Sephardic community in Cuba. And even though initially he said he didn't want to be in my film and didn't want to have anything to do with this project, he ended up being in the film. He's really one of the most interesting characters in the film. And people in Cuba, that he's their favorite character. And one of the jokes in the Jewish community in Cuba is, when is your father coming to Cuba? Because they all know that he doesn't want to go from the movie. And so it was a really interesting project for me. My father was included in the film, so was my mother. And I discovered things that I might not have known if I hadn't made a film. This is a Jewish cemetery in New Jersey. And there's a portion of it that is dedicated to Shevet Ahim, to that old synagogue from Cuba. So this is the Shevet Ahim part of the cemetery. It's where my paternal grandparents are buried, and it's where my parents want to be buried when they die. And so there was that personal part to the documentary, but then there was that ethnographic part. And so I interviewed many people, got to know many people for this film, and two of the people that became very central were these two kids that I got to know very well. Zenaida, who was 12 at the time, who is a mix of Afro-Cuban and Jewish-Cuban, and her father is Sephardic. Her mother is a Jehovah's Witness. And so she grew up with these two religions, but her father brought her up as Jewish, and he was preparing her for her bat mitzvah. He was teaching her how to chant and teaching her Hebrew. And the other person was this boy, Miguelito, who also had this dream of making Aliyah, of immigrating to Israel. And he wanted to be a drummer. And so he would drum on the buckets that they used to bring water, hot water from the stove to the tub to bathe with. Those were his drums. And so these two young people made a really deep impression on me, and they became central characters in this story. And they were both on the verge of leaving Cuba, and I was on the verge of trying to come back to Cuba, trying to make my Adieu Querida, my Goodbye Dear Love, try to see if a goodbye could become a return. And I was finding that these two young people wanted to leave, and they found their way to Israel, where they live currently. Danaida with her Dominican husband, and they now have two children. That's Jose Levy, who you saw before, and Miguelito, now grown up, as you see, with his sister and mother. They live in Israel as well. So they're now part of this interesting diversity of Israel, this Afro-Cuban, Jewish-Cuban culture that they bring there. I went on from there to work on this book, An Island Called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba. It came out in Spanish as well. And so this was, I started doing the work in the 90s and took it to the early 2000s. And a very interesting moment, because Cuba changed its constitution and declared that you could be a member of the Communist Party and have a religious affiliation. So people started coming back to religion in the 90s. And I love this picture because you can kind of see all of the secular heroes, and then you see, you know, the Sacred Heart of Christ there as well, and sort of all of them converging on the walls that this woman has. By the way, it's not a Jewish woman, in case you were concerned. So it's a moment of revitalization of religion. Cuba comes back to religion in the 90s after trying to enforce atheism under communism, and so Santeria, one of the Afro-Cuban religions, also known as Regla de Ocha, but popularly known as Santeria, also started to become very important again in this era. Huge revitalization of this religion took place, and the Jewish community reached out to the Joint Distribution Committee in New York for support to try to bring the community together. People had really dispersed, and there wasn't really a community. Very few people were attending synagogues. Some of the synagogues had shut down. Havana, which had 5 synagogues, has 3 that are still functioning. There had been synagogues in the provinces as well that had shut down in the period, the heyday period of the revolution, but some of the elders had managed to maintain Jewish customs in the synagogue. But there was a need to revitalize, there was a need to teach people Hebrew, to learn how to run services, teach Jewish history, all these kinds of things, and the Joint Distribution Committee was very, very important in sending that aid, sending financial aid, and also sending Argentine teachers to teach the Jews of Cuba how to be Jews again, right? And they sent Argentinos because, of course, they speak Spanish, and so it made much more sense than to send American teachers. So the community started to revitalize. Dr. Miller, who you see here, who was a dental surgeon, passed away later, but he was instrumental in bringing about this change. And so it's a moment in which a lot of aid starts to come to the Jewish community, Hope by the Planeload, as you see here, and many, many Jewish philanthropic organizations start helping this tiny community of about 1,500 Jews. So this community becomes kind of everybody's mitzvah project, like these are the people that we have to help and the people that we have to save. A lot of curiosity in this time about Fidel Castro and the Jews, because people wondered, you know, the Jews haven't experienced any, you know, under communism they haven't experienced any discrimination. There's a kosher butcher shop in Havana that was never closed down after the revolution, and so it's kind of this consideration, this understanding that the Jews need kosher meat and so on. So people wondered about this, what might be Fidel Castro's, you know, particular interest in the Jews, and some have said that he may be of Sephardic ancestry, so was of Sephardic ancestry, obviously he's passed away. So anyway, so this was something that was being discussed quite a lot at the time. This is Adela Dworin, who is the president of the Jewish community of Cuba, and she plays such an important role. She was studying law when the revolution began, and her family wanted to leave Cuba, and she begged her parents to stay, and she ended up staying, and she's just such a personality in the community. She speaks Spanish, of course, English, and Yiddish, and she receives all of these Jewish missions, many of which continue to come to Cuba. And she really is kind of the face of the Jewish community, and she makes many very important decisions because Jews in Cuba are allowed to leave to Israel if they wish, as Danaida and Miguelito left. And so she has to make many, many key decisions that really end up informing the destiny of many people in the community. And so she's sitting here in the library. The Patronato Synagogue has the only Jewish library in Cuba. And again, you see this interesting conjuncture of Jewish and Cuban. That's a bust of Jose Marti on the desk, and then the Jewish star. And she presides over a space that was created in the 1950s by all those Jews that were part of that exodus in the 60s, that 90% of the community that left, that I was a part of that exodus. And here you can see when that was first built, the synagogue was first built, and this was inaugurated. So this synagogue, which is the synagogue that is half a block away from where I lived as a child, this synagogue has become a kind of pilgrimage site, and it's not just Jews who go there, it's like all visitors are very curious about the Jewish community. They all converge on the Patronato, on this Jewish community center. As you can see, and Adela often receives these visitors who come with this tremendous curiosity to understand this Jewish community. And so the Jews of Cuba have become a kind of a tourist site as well, and many go to the cemetery. This is the very cemetery where my cousin Henry is buried, and the cemetery has become a destination as well for many Jews from all over the world who visit Cuba. And so in this project, I worked with a Cuban photographer, Humberto Mayol, who at the time was still working in analog photography, and he would take these black and white pictures and develop them in his kitchen. So we were working together on this project, and he didn't even know that there was a Jewish community in Cuba until we started working together. We kept trying to look for these conjunctures of Jewish and Cuban, and this for me was one of his most amazing pictures, because it looks like Che Guevara is in the synagogue, right? It looks like he's there in that procession, looking at the viewer. And so going to Cuba became this touristic anthropological Jewish solidarity mission, and this kind of fascination with the Jews of Cuba was something that came to fascinate me as an anthropologist. And I had to figure out, what could I do that might be different from that of others going to look at gaze upon this community. And so I started talking to Jews in Havana and all over Cuba, and just asking them if they had saved anything of their Jewish heritage. And so people started showing me photographs and documents. It was really a very historical project in many ways. And so this was a poignant moment where this woman, Sarah, who's Sephardic, showed me these two pictures. And so the one on the left, this was in 1959, all of those young women were celebrating their quinceañera. So in Cuba, as in the rest of Latin America, it's the 15th birthday. It's kind of like, the debutante thing that girls celebrate their 15th rather than their 16th. And so all of these young women, Jewish young women, were celebrating their quince in 1959, and that's her. And then she says to me, well, of all those women, the only one who's still in Cuba is me. And so there was this sense, I began to get the sense of this small Jewish community feeling somewhat shipwrecked on the island, the last ones still holding on to this Jewish tradition. Albertico showing me his talit and showing me his kippah. Those were brought by his grandfather from Turkey. And then this was one of the most moving encounters. He recently passed away, Jaime Gans Green, who lived in a small town on the eastern end of Cuba, Palma Soriano, near Santiago de Cuba. And I was taken to meet him and didn't know what to expect. I'd been warned that he was very reclusive, that maybe he wouldn't really want to speak to me. But we started talking, and again I asked him, well, do you have anything at all and that you could show me of Jewish history? And he started pulling out letters and pictures, and this letter in Yiddish from family that died in the Holocaust, and then this incredibly moving picture of a postcard with Hitler stamps on it that apparently came from a concentration camp, and that had ended up in his hands in Palma Soriano on the eastern end of Cuba, and showing it to me here. So that was incredibly moving, and I also wanted to talk to the Jewish communists, because I had been warned by my mother that they would try to convert me to communism. I should be really careful, that they were going to say beautiful things about Cuba, palabras muy bonitas, and they were going to talk me into being communist. She was very worried about this, and so I decided I would like try and see if I could talk to them. And so I talked to several. This is Fabio Grobart, whose father was one of the founders of the Cuban Communist Party, a Polish Jew. His name was Abram Simchovich, but he became Fabio Grobart in Cuba. His father and his son, Fabio Grobart Jr., has the same name. And this Fabio Grobart used to introduce Fidel Castro at the meetings of the Cuban Communist Party until his death in the 90s. And so he's showing that picture here. Enrique Oltuski worked in various ministries, among the Ministry of Fisheries for a while, and he asked to be photographed with a picture of Jose Marti, and he fought with Che Guevara in the revolution. So these Jews were very, very interesting to me, the Jewish revolutionaries that I wouldn't have known about if I hadn't gone to Cuba. And then this is a father and son. You don't see the father very well in the background, but they're both scientists. This is Ernesto. And he's named Ernesto, his father named him Ernesto after Ernesto Che Guevara. So he's named after Che Guevara. And he's a physicist. He's the dean of the physics department at the University of Havana. And when I asked him how he related to Jewishness, he says, well, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in anything, but I do believe in Einstein. And so So his dream is, and I think he's still working on this, the dream is to see if a big statue of Einstein can be built at the University of Havana. So that was kind of his dream. And so the Cuban government, being very aware of all this interest in Jewishness in Cuba, decided in the early 2000s to create a Jewish-themed hotel. And I write about this in my book, The Hotel Raquel. And it's very interesting, so they have rooms with the names of different Old Testament characters. So there's Abraham and Rachel and Sarah and Rebecca and so on. And then there was the Ruth room. And when I stayed there when they opened in the early 2000s, I had brought a group to Cuba and they had reserved the Ruth room for me. And so it led to a lot of reflections as to whether I would ever be able to go back and find home in Cuba, whether I would just have a room with my name on it in a Jewish-themed hotel. So I'm probably running out of time, but if you'll let me talk a little more, I'll share a few more stories. So I've also become interested in the Jewish-Cuban community in Miami. I didn't grow up with that community because I grew up in New York, but part of my family decided to move to Miami in the 70s, so part of my family is part of this community, the other part stayed in New York. So I'm very interested in the Jewish Cubans in Miami. They call themselves Jubans. Los Cubanos. And so to me they're a very intriguing community because I also kind of see them a little bit as an anthropologist since I didn't get to grow up there. And so it's a very interesting community. This woman, Frida, was amazing, an old friend of my grandmother's who taught Hebrew in Miami after arriving from Cuba. And so this is a community that, again, arrived penniless from Cuba to Miami, had to remake itself all over again, and many of them in the community have become extremely wealthy, among them Abel Holtz, who even has a boulevard named after him in Miami. And curiously enough, the community built 2 synagogues in Miami Beach, as you might expect, one Ashkenazi synagogue and one Sephardic synagogue, and so the Cuban Hebrew synagogue here. They built their temple right near Lincoln Road, if you know Miami Beach. And you can see here how exile memory is working. So they're honoring the memory of the Patronato back in Havana, right? That's what they're trying to recreate in Miami. And Ofelia, who's been an administrator of this community since its founding, is an incredible woman. And you see she's got the Cuban and the American flag there together. And then there is Temple Moses, which is the Sephardic Cuban synagogue in Miami Beach and Moses. And here too, exile memory coming up. They are remembering being Jewish refugees from Cuba. And the women at the Sephardic Temple in Temple Moses, if you're ever in Miami Beach on a Tuesday, do you want to go to Temple Moses and get some borrekas? Borrekas or boreks, as they're also called in Turkish, and these are a staple of Sephardic cooking. And so the women on Tuesdays make the borrekas and sell them to the community, and it's a very important part of their fundraising. So, and the men, as in Cuba, love to play dominoes. And so to me, it's really interesting that this custom is significant, that they brought it with them from Cuba. The men in Miami frequently get together, play dominoes, and I did some research as well. There's cemeteries, 2 cemeteries in Miami where there are a large number of the Cuban Jews are buried. And I found this Marcos Behar, not a relative of mine. The Behar name is a fairly common Sephardic name, and I was so moved by this tombstone. Abuelo Papi, el rey del domino, the king of domino, en nuestro corazón siempre, in our hearts always. And as you can see, you know, Jews have the custom of leaving stones in tombstones, but they have dominoes there. So the dominoes are there to remember him. I thought that was pretty amazing. And most of the Cuban Jews don't go to Cuba, but several have gone back. Many went back during the Obama period of normalization. And this is a family that I know, Moreno Habib's family. They went, and interestingly, they chose to be photographed in front of the Tropicana. And I was really glad that they went because soon after Moreno Habib passed away, but he got to go with his wife and children and grandchildren to Cuba. So there's a new Jewish community in Cuba now, since doing that project for my book that I've also been studying and looking at. And it's an interesting community because it's become a celebrity community. So many people have gone to see this community. Steven Spielberg was there, and who do you think signed this? She was there more recently in Cuba, just the range of celebrities that go there. This is Madonna. So Madonna went and, said hello at the Patronato. And so many incredible celebrities have been, and Congress people, and all kinds of people go there. And so it's become this kind of community that people have their eyes on. And it's also interesting that the communities in the provinces have also been revitalized. These are people from the Santa Clara community, so their synagogue shut down during the early years of the revolution, and they were able to get a new space and build a new synagogue with support from some of the American Jewish communities. And so this is kind of their symbol, the island there on top of the menorah. And then there's a community, well, there's other communities, but there's an important community in Guantanamo as well, which we don't tend to associate with Jews, but there's a Jewish community as well. They're descendants of two brothers with the Mizrahi last name who had many, many children. They each had about 10 children. And so all of these people are descendants of those brothers, and there's a community there as well. I'm very intrigued by this tombstone in Cuba. Luis Lapidus, who's an architect, and here they chose to show the two stars, the Jewish star and the communist star, in his tombstone. And this is his widow, his wife, Miriam, who works in Casas Americas in Cuba. And she's in fact posing in front of the kosher butcher shop in Havana. They now have a Holocaust exhibit in the Sephardic synagogue, so this is like part of how this community has now connected more with global Jewish history, and particularly with the American Jewish community. They're very aware that people who come to see them want to take some sort of souvenir with them, and so they're creating all kinds of handicrafts now, like these kippas here that are for sale. And they now hold these very, very large celebrations for the major holidays like Hanukkah. And these parties are like performative displays of Jewishness where they invite leaders of other religious communities, and also anybody who's visiting Jewish missions that come from the United States and Canada and other places will also attend these big celebrations. And to me, this is so curious that they have placed this enormous Cuban flag in the sanctuary, so there's no doubt that this is a Cuban Jewish community. And they did some things in this last celebration, I think this was 2016, they did some really, really interesting things. So this man, Salomon, I write about him in my book, he was considered the schnorrer of the community. So somebody who was always trying to get something, begging for support, like any of the foreigners that were nearby, he'd come and ask for money, ask for help. And he was omnipresent because he moved from one synagogue to another, like looking for people to help him. And so when reporters would go to Cuba, they would always end up meeting him because he was just everywhere. And so I was really, really, really intrigued. At this Hanukkah party, they had various performances, and one of them was a skit. Salomon had since passed away by this moment. There was a skit where this young man was playing Salomon the Schnorrer. So he's become kind of a character, like a personality within the Jewish community. And dancing is an important part of how their Jewishness is performed to outsiders. They have a Rikudim, an Israeli dancing group, and this young man who you see here in the front is a dancer, choreographer who helps them put together these incredible, really, really impressive dance numbers. And also recently, 2015, this is the first time that the Jewish youth were able to participate in the Maccabean Games. And they went to Chile for the first time with some outside support, and this was really a big deal, and for the community a sense that they're really becoming part of the Latin American Jewish community as well as the universal global Jewish community. This couple is very interesting. David Prinstein is the vice president of the Jewish community. He really does like all of the logistical stuff, and that's his wife Marlene. And Marlene is a convert or a Jew by choice, and most of the Jews in Cuba today are Jews by choice or converts. They either have some Jewish ancestry on one side of the family or the other, or they've married somebody who has Jewish ancestry. That's the only way to be able to join the Jewish community in Cuba. And she's a very active person. She runs this whole dance company, the whole Ricardine company. Rosa Behar, not my relative, but an important member of the community as well. She overlooks the pharmacy. They get a lot of medical support from visitors. And the Canadian Jewish Congress and the American community as well sends a lot of support, particularly around Passover, and they get things like gefilte fish, which you see here. And now they have some support, and they're able to make challah on Friday night. They make Hamantaschen, tropical style, as my mother does, filled with guava paste. As you see here, and so Purim is a holiday where the girls, with young women, dress up as Queen Esther, and that's, you see the girls here, and you see the diversity also of girls here, of backgrounds in the community. So it's a community that now has become well known to the world, very, very photographed, very just, there, iconography there, and so it's at once kind of exoticized and normalized, I feel, at the same time. You can find information about this community quite easily. It's a community that is growing smaller in many ways. Every time I go back, it seems to me that there's fewer people, but they always say there's 1,000 Jews in Cuba. It's kind of like a Kabbalistic number. So if like 100 leave for Israel, another 100 reappear somehow. So 1,000 is the number of Jews in Cuba, and we'll just go with that number. But it's a very, very small community, but relative to its size, still a very vibrant group that maintains the traditions. And so I was involved in a very interesting project last year, bringing this Yiddish Cuban opera to Cuba that was composed by Frank London, if you know about him. He's a klezmer musician and composer, and it's called Atwe. And Atwe was a Native American in Cuba at the time of the conquest of Cuba, and he ended up being burnt at the stake because he refused to allow himself to be converted to Catholicism, because he asked the Spaniards if there were Spaniards in heaven, and when he was told that there were, he said he didn't want to go there. And so he was burnt, and he's a legendary figure in Cuba. And this man, Oscar Pines, a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant who arrived in Cuba with his family at the age of 12, escaping the pogroms in the Ukraine, he ended up writing a poem in Yiddish celebrating the story of Atwe. So it's a poem that has nothing to do with being Jewish. It was Atwe. And anyway, he wrote it in Yiddish, and then it was subsequently translated into Spanish and became part of the literary world in Cuba. And then subsequently he left for the United States and worked for the Yiddish press in New York and so on. And anyway, his son-in-law and some other people, this Frank London, have created this incredible opera based on this, it's a long epic poem about Atwe, which is very significant because Atwe really got treated very badly, in a sense, in Cuba. Atwe became a beer label, and so this legendary figure kind of lost some of his epic value, in a sense, with this commercialization. And so there was tremendous interest in Cuba in bringing this opera to Cuba. We worked with La Opera de la Calle, a street opera company in Havana, to bring this opera and to work with Cuban performers, not Jewish, who were very, very interested in kind of learning about this history. So I'm going to end now. I'm sure I've gone way over on time, and thank all of you for your patience. I'm going to end with the fictional recreations now. You already saw some of my poetry, and I wrote a poem called The Broken Streets of My City a couple of years ago, both in Spanish and English, and I've worked with this wonderful group of people in Matanzas who make handmade books, and this is how these poems first appeared. And it was a poem, this Broken Streets of My City. It's a very, very long poem that's all about various kinds of brokenness. The actual broken streets in Havana that I tripped over and nearly hurt myself. Other things that are broken, some of the broken graves that I've found in the Jewish cemetery. And also what's broken is the relationship sometimes between Cuban Americans or the Cuban exile and the island. And that's the case with my parents, who have never been back to Cuba and who I wish would go to Cuba with me. And so in this poem I talk about wanting them to go with me. I come back an old child, now they call me Señora. I still come back after so many years, an old little girl, una niña vieja. Mami y papi, please come back, walk these broken streets of our Havana together with me. Listen to me, your niña vieja. Let me lead you through these broken streets. And more recently, as was mentioned, I've written a young adult novel called Lucky Broken Girl. And I had never really written about our immigrant story. As an anthropologist, I was always going to places, whether Spain, Mexico, or Cuba, and always leaving the United States and not thinking at all about that immigrant story and what it was like even for me to be this immigrant child growing up in New York. And so I decided to start telling that story and thinking about the lives that we had when we arrived in New York in the 60s. This is the building where we lived when we first arrived in Queens, New York. You saw it in an earlier picture. That's my grandfather with one of my cousins, my mother and my Aunt Sylvia there on the street where we lived, and I with my cousins and my brother. Birthday party there in New York, and again, discovering snow, which was such a big deal for us. And so one of the things that happened in my childhood that I wrote about in my book, The Vulnerable Observer, and an essay called The Girl in the Cast, we had recently arrived from Cuba, and we ended up in this terrible car accident in New York, on the Belt Parkway, for those of you that know New York, big highway in New York. And my father was very excited. He just got in a car. He was like beginning to live the American dream, and we were in this terrible accident. And I was particularly hurt back in this era where kids didn't use seat belts in the back seat, because I was lying down in the back seat on my grandmother's lap. And I ended up breaking the femur on my right leg, a very, very bad break to that leg. And I had to be in a body cast for a year. I had to be in bed for a year taken care of by my mother. And of course I never forgot that, and I wrote about it in The Vulnerable Observer, but what I couldn't do at the time, it took 50 years, what I couldn't do at the time was to tell the story from the girl's perspective, not as the woman looking back on the girl, but to actually inhabit that body again as the girl. And that's what I was able to do in this book, or tried to do in this book, Lucky Broken Girl. I'm just going to read to end a little section from it. And so this is this period, the story takes place in 1966. It's the time of go-go boots, if you recall Nancy Sinatra's go-go boots. And the character in the story, Ruthie, based on me, but not me at the same time, she's very happy at the beginning of the story because she really wants go-go boots, and her mother tells her they can't afford the go-go boots. Then her father comes home with a pair of go-go boots that he found on sale for her, and she's happy, and everything seems like it's going to be perfect. And then they're in this accident, and she ends up in bed for a year. And this is a picture that a friend of mine in Cuba made to show that. So I'm just going to read this this little segment. And one of the characters that's important in the story is my grandmother, my maternal grandmother that you've heard about, my grandmother Esther, who visits Ruthie and tells her stories to entertain her, to take her mind off of the experience of being in bed. Baba, I should have to be Ruthie. Baba, please tell me the story of how you got from Poland to Cuba. But you've heard that story many times, she says. I know, but I want to hear it again. Baba pushes the chair closer to my bed. She takes my hand and begins telling me the story. Ay, Shana Madeline, what a time that was. If you can imagine, I was only 18. It was 1925 when I said goodbye to my family and took a train from Warsaw to Rotterdam. Then I boarded a big ship. What was it like, Baba, to travel all by yourself? Were you very scared? I was scared, of course. I had never traveled before, on either a train or a ship. The train was crowded with lots of sweaty people, but I thought for sure it would be romantic to be on a ship at sea. But no, that ship carried cows and sheep and goats and a few people. It was like Noah's Ark. Did the trip seem very long to you? Days and days at sea?
I thought we'd never arrive. I missed my family and didn't know if I'd ever see them again. I was going to a strange land where I didn't know anyone. There was the ocean on all sides, endless, and the smell of salt and brine was so strong, all the food tasted like a sour pickle. Then one day, a seagull flapped its wings near us. We were close to land, and soon we reached the shores of the beautiful island of Cuba. I began a new life. I tasted fruits I never knew existed, like mango and papaya. The sweetness of pineapple seemed a gift from heaven. And the people were kind. No one said a bad word to me because I was Jewish. I met Zayden, and together we worked and brought my mama and papa and my brothers and sisters from Poland to Cuba. We were so happy. Baba is quiet for some time. Then she rubs her eyes, holding back the tears, not able to let go of all the sadness she carries with her. If we hadn't gone to Cuba, we would not be here talking today, Baba tells me. Cuba saved us from Hitler and the war. When you were born, our first grandchild, you were a gift of hope. We thought our home would always be in Cuba. And then we had to leave Cuba and come here to New York. I have been a refugee, not once, but twice. But somehow, we found the strength to start from nothing a second time. And now, we're happy, aren't we, Baba? Like Papi says, we're in a free country. Oh, Shana Medela, I tell you, we are, but I won't be at peace until you are out of this cast and able to walk. Please, Baba, don't cry. I'm going to get well. We just have to be patient, like you were on that ship. Yes, that's right, Baba replies and gives me a smile. Everything comes to those who wait. Gracias, Baba. Will you tell me the story again another day? Of course, Shana Medele, as many times as you want. My life has become a story. One day, your life will become a story too. Oh, that's going to take forever, I sigh. But you'll get there, Shana Medele. I promise. All we can do is have faith that life leads us where it does for a reason, so we can learn things we didn't know about ourselves. One day, you will look back on your suffering, and you will find a meaning for it, and that will be your story. Thank you.
There'll be time for questions. We'll take one or two questions now, and then we've got a reception, so we'll invite people to ask their questions in a more informal way downstairs. So, and then perhaps we'll start questions right downstairs. I just want to thank our speaker for sharing her story so wonderfully with us today. And so I ask you all to join me in thanking her. And the questions, I'm sure she would be happy to take over food and refreshments downstairs. So hope you'll stay to ask your questions.